The cold wind howled over the jagged cliffs of Scorched Peak as the last human boy, Aaron, stood at the edge of the dragon's nest, his fate sealed by those who had abandoned him. Below, the valley stretched in endless desolation, the ruins of his once proud civilization buried beneath the blackened earth. The last remnants of his people had given him up willingly, their final desperate plea for survival uttered in solemn whispers as they left him here, alone. The air smelled of ash and smoke, thick with the lingering essence of fire that had long since reshaped the land. The nest itself was a cavernous pit, lined with molten rock and scattered bones, some ancient, some fresh. Aaron swallowed hard, his small fists clenching at his sides. He had always known he was different, always sensed that he did not fit within the trembling remnants of humanity that still clung to existence in the shadow of the dragons. And now they had cast him away. High above, the sky churned with thick, rolling clouds, glowing crimson from the inferno of the mountain's restless core. The wind carried with it the distant echoes of wings, massive wings, beating against the sky. Aaron turned his gaze upward. The dragons were coming. His heart pounded against his ribs, but he did not flee. He had no home to run to. The first shadow broke through the clouds, a monstrous shape gliding effortlessly over the cliffs. Then another. And another. A dozen massive creatures emerged from the heavens, their scales glinting like molten gold, their eyes burning like embers in the fading daylight. Aaron could barely breathe. He had grown up hearing the stories, the whispered myths of the Fireborn, the rulers of the sky who had reshaped the world with their flames. The dragons had not always been the enemy, but something had changed in the past centuries. Now they reigned above all, and humans were nothing more than trespassers on a world that no longer belonged to them. A deafening roar split the sky. Aaron braced himself as the largest of the dragons descended, its wings sending a blast of hot air rolling through the nest. The ground trembled beneath its landing, the sheer force of its presence enough to make the very stones groan. It was colossal, larger than any living thing Aaron had ever seen. Its scales rippled with heat, shifting between black and gold, a living forge of endless fire. Its eyes, ancient and all-knowing, locked onto him with an intensity that sent a chill through his spine. This was Morath, the Elder of Flames. Aaron knew he should kneel. He knew he should beg for mercy, for a swift death, as every other sacrifice before him had, but he did not. Instead, he stood firm, his chin lifted in quiet defiance. Morath tilted his head, his molten eyes narrowing. Why does a human child stand in the lair of dragons? The words rumbled through the air, not spoken in any language Aaron knew, yet somehow he understood them. They carried weight, power, a voice that had witnessed the turning of centuries. Aaron took a breath, steadying himself. I was left here, he said, his voice stronger than he expected. Given to you as a sacrifice. Morath let out a low, rumbling sound that might have been amusement, or perhaps something darker. A sacrifice? His massive claws scraped against the stone as he shifted forward. Is that what they call it? Aaron didn't flinch as the dragon's head lowered, the heat of its breath washing over him. You do not kneel, Morath observed. You do not tremble. Aaron met the dragon's gaze, his body taut but unyielding. Would it change anything if I did? Silence. Then, to Aaron's astonishment, Morath let out a deep, resounding laugh. No, the dragon rumbled. It would not. And with that, the fate of the last human boy began to change. The other dragons circled above, their great wings stirring the thick smoke that clung to the mountain's peak. Aaron remained still, his body tense, but his mind racing. He had expected fire, pain, death. But Morath simply studied him, as if measuring something unseen, something deeper than flesh and bone. You are different, the elder dragon mused, his molten eyes never leaving Aaron. The others before you begged. Some wept. Many tried to run. Aaron swallowed. He had heard the stories, the whispered tales of those who had been cast into the dragon's nest before him. None had returned. Morath tilted his head slightly. But you stand as though you are waiting for something. Aaron hesitated. Am I not waiting for death? The dragon exhaled sharply, a plume of smoke curling from his nostrils. Death is not what waits for you here. The word sent a shiver down Aaron's spine. A smaller dragon, its scales the color of burning embers, landed beside Morath, eyes filled with suspicion. He is human, it hissed, Why do we not consume him as we have the others? Morath did not look away from Aaron, because he is not like the others. The ember-scaled dragon snorted, stepping closer, its talons scraping against the blackened rock. His kind destroyed their own world with greed and war. They burned the land long before we ever did. Aaron clenched his fists. That was not my choice. The dragon let out a low growl. And yet, you bear their blood. Morath lifted his great head, his gaze sweeping over the gathered dragons. Perhaps, but this one does not fear us. He does not cower. There is something in him that I have not seen in centuries. The embers around the nest flared as Morath leaned in closer, his voice like the rolling of distant thunder. Tell me, human, he said. If you were given the chance to live, what would you do with it? Aaron's breath caught. It was a question he had never been asked before. Live. He had never been meant to live. He had been cast away, forgotten, left for the fire to claim. But now, standing before the great beasts who had ruled the sky for generations, he realized something. He didn't want to die. He wanted more. He lifted his chin. I would learn, he said, his voice steady. I would listen, and I would prove that my kind were not all monsters. Morath considered him for a long moment. Then, he smiled, a fearsome, ancient expression. Then you shall have your chance. Aaron blinked. What? Morath's golden eyes burned brighter. You are no longer a sacrifice. You are ours now. The other dragons shifted, some hissing in protest, others watching in silence. The ember-scaled dragon snarled. You mean to let him live? Morath turned his gaze to the sky. I mean to see what fate has planned for him. Aaron's heart pounded as the realization sank in. He had not been spared. He had been claimed. Aaron was no longer human, at least not in the way he had once been. He was no longer a boy abandoned to die, but something else entirely. Claimed, marked, bound to the dragons in a way he did not yet understand. The days that followed were grueling, a test of endurance unlike anything he had known. The nest was a world of its own, carved into the fiery mountains, its walls glowing with molten veins of rock. The heat never ceased. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur, and the sounds of dragons filled every waking moment. They moved like living storms, their wings beating against the wind, their roars rolling through the sky like thunder. At first they ignored him. Most of them believed he would perish on his own, unable to withstand the merciless world they inhabited. They expected the heat to break him, the hunger to drive him mad, or the isolation to consume him entirely. But Aaron was human, and humans endured. He scavenged what he could, learning quickly what the dragons ate and what scraps they discarded. He drank from the heated pools of water that formed in the cracks of the stone, swallowing down the burning liquid until his throat felt raw. He slept where he could, pressing himself against the warm rocks, listening to the distant sound of wings slicing through the sky. And all the while, Morath watched. The great golden dragon never spoke, never interfered. But his presence was a constant shadow over Aaron's existence. Whenever the boy faltered, whenever exhaustion threatened to pull him under, those molten eyes would find him, judging, waiting, deciding. Then, on the seventh night, Morath finally spoke. You have not died, he observed, his voice a slow, deliberate rumble. Aaron, exhausted but still standing, turned to him. I was never planning to. The dragon exhaled, a plume of smoke curling from his nostrils. Perhaps not, but survival is not the same as belonging. Aaron wiped the sweat from his brow, his body aching from the constant strain. Then tell me what I must do to belong. The embers around Morath's feet flared. You must earn your place. Aaron's breath hitched, his fingers curling into the stone. How? Morath leaned in closer, the heat of his breath washing over Aaron like the edge of a wildfire. You will take the trial of the sky. If you survive, you will be one of us. If you fail, the dragon's golden eyes burned brighter. Then you will fall, and the world will forget you. Aaron swallowed hard. There was no fear in his heart, only a certainty that this was what he had been meant for. I accept, he said, his voice steady. Morath's lips curled slightly, a draconic approximation of amusement. Then let the winds decide your fate. Dawn came swift and merciless, casting long golden streaks across the mountains as the dragons gathered at the edge of the highest peak. Aaron stood among them, his skin slick with sweat from the relentless heat, his heart pounding against his ribs. The trial of the sky was legend, a test that had determined the fate of many before him. but no human had ever taken it. Morath stood at the edge of the precipice, his golden wings unfurled, his massive claws digging into the stone. "You will climb," he announced, his voice carrying across the gathered dragons. "Not through rock, but through the air." Eren frowned. "Through the air?" The golden dragon turned to him, his molten gaze unwavering. "You will take your place on the back of a dragon, and you will ride." A murmur rippled through the crowd of beasts. Some hissed in disapproval, others exchanged glances filled with intrigue. Eren's stomach tightened. He had never flown before. He had never even been close enough to a dragon to touch one, at least not in a way that didn't mean death. Morath gestured to the cliffs. "If you fall, you will not be saved. If you cannot hold on, you are not worthy of the skies." Eren took a deep breath. He could do this. He had to do this. From the gathered dragons, a sleek, crimson-scaled beast stepped forward, its eyes gleaming with a mixture of challenge and suspicion. It was smaller than Morath, but still massive, its wings spanning nearly 30 feet across. "This is Vash," Morath said. "She does not suffer weakness." The red dragon snorted, smoke rising from her nostrils. "I do not carry burdens." Morath's eyes gleamed. "Then we shall see if he is one." Eren exhaled, stepping forward. Vash regarded him with a predator's gaze, her massive body tensed with expectation. Then, without warning, she moved. The ground shifted beneath Eren as the dragon twisted, her wings slicing through the air as she launched herself toward the sky. Eren had seconds to react. He jumped, his hands grabbing for anything solid, his fingers finding purchase on the ridges of her scales just as she soared over the cliffside. The air ripped past him. The wind roared in his ears. Vash twisted, trying to shake him off, her body rolling through the sky like a living storm. Eren gritted his teeth, his grip tightening, his muscles screaming in protest as the world spun violently around him. "Fell," Vash snarled, banking sharply. "Not a chance," Eren shouted back, his voice barely audible over the wind. The dragon dove. Eren felt his stomach drop, the weightlessness pressing against his chest as the ground hurtled toward them. His fingers slipped just for a second, but he adjusted, his legs locking around the base of her neck, his hands gripping the ridges of her spine. Then, just before impact, Vash snapped her wings open, the force of it nearly wrenching Eren from his seat. She climbed again, her powerful body cutting through the air, her movements smoother now, less violent. She was testing him, and Eren had not failed. The wind pressed against his skin, the air so thin it made his head light. But beneath him, the dragon was no longer trying to throw him off. She was flying with him. Eren's heart pounded. The fire in his veins burned bright. He had never felt so alive. Below, the dragons watched from the cliffs, their eyes widening as the boy who was meant to be a sacrifice rode among the clouds. Morath's lips curled into a knowing smile. "He does not fall," the great dragon murmured. The others whispered among themselves, shifting uneasily. A human had never survived the trial of the sky. Until now. Vash let out a fierce, triumphant roar, and Eren threw his head back, laughing into the wind. The sky had been denied to his kind for centuries, but now it belonged to him once more. The wind roared in Eren's ears, fierce and untamed, a force that had ruled this world long before men had ever walked upon it. He clung to Vash's back, his fingers dug deep into the warm ridges of her scales, his legs locked around the base of her neck. The air was thin here, the ground distant and insignificant below them. The trial of the sky was not merely about riding, it was about proving that he belonged. Vash flew higher, slicing through the clouds, her powerful wings carrying them toward the burning horizon. Every twist, every sudden dive, every impossible maneuver tested Eren's resolve, but he did not loosen his grip. He had survived the flames, endured the scorn of the dragons, and now he would own the sky itself. She tilted her wings sharply, rolling to the side, trying to force him off. Eren growled, adjusting his balance, reading her movements before they happened. "You are stubborn," Vash called over the rush of air, amusement laced beneath the growl of her voice. Eren forced a breath through clenched teeth. "You're just mad I haven't fallen yet." Vash let out a sharp, guttural laugh, then suddenly dove. Eren's stomach lurched as the world fell away, the force of their descent pressing against his chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. Wind screamed around him, his hair whipped back as they plummeted toward the jagged cliffs below. A warning howl erupted from the mountainside. The other dragons were watching. Aaron could feel them, waiting for him to fail. His pulse thundered in his ears. He could not fail. At the last possible moment, Vash snapped her wings open, catching the air in a violent surge that nearly sent Aaron flying from her back. His grip slipped, just for a moment, but he forced himself to hold on, his body pressing low against the dragon's spine. And then they were rising again. Vash let out a victorious snarl, her body twisting in one final display of power before she slowed, circling the peaks. Aaron's chest burned from exertion, but his grip was firm. He had not fallen. Below, Morath and the other dragons watched in silence. Vash finally landed atop the great ridge of the mountain, her claws scraping against the stone as she folded her wings against her sides. Aaron exhaled, his arms trembling from the strain, his heart hammering. His feet touched solid ground, but his body still felt like it was soaring. He turned toward Morath, standing tall despite the exhaustion weighing him down. The elder dragon watched him for a long moment. Then he spoke. "You are not prey," Morath declared, his voice rolling like distant thunder. "You are one of us." Aaron's breath hitched. He had done it. The dragons, even those who had doubted him, bowed their heads. Aaron was no longer a sacrifice, no longer a prisoner of fate. He had claimed the sky itself. The air was heavy with expectation. The dragons had gathered atop the highest peaks, their massive bodies casting long shadows across the volcanic ridges. Aaron stood at the center of it all, feeling the weight of their gazes, the heat of the molten veins that ran beneath the stone. He had proven himself, had survived trials no human ever had, yet something unspoken still lingered in the air. Acceptance was not the same as command. Morath stepped forward, the ground trembling beneath his weight. "You have earned your place among us," the great dragon said. "But names hold power, and you are still nameless." Aaron frowned. "I already have a name." Morath's molten eyes flickered. "That is your human name, but you are no longer just human, you are something new." A murmur rippled through the gathering dragons. Some watched in silent approval, others with lingering doubt. They had never named an outsider before. Vash stepped closer, her amber gaze sharp and assessing. "A name is not given lightly, it must be earned." Aaron squared his shoulders. "Then how do I earn it?" Morath turned his gaze toward the sky, where the winds howled between the cliffs, where the embers of dying fires drifted like stars. "There is a flame that has burned longer than even the dragons remember," he said, his voice deep with reverence. "It sleeps in the heart of the mountain, a fire untouched by time. If you are to carry our name, you must claim it." Aaron swallowed hard. He had thought he had already been through the worst of his trials. But this was something more. "The eternal flame," Vash murmured. "No dragon has dared to approach it for generations." Aaron's pulse quickened. "Why not?" Vash's gaze darkened. "Because it chooses who is worthy." Morath's golden eyes locked onto Aaron. "And now it will choose you." Silence fell over the mountains. Aaron knew what was being asked of him. If he failed, the dragons would never truly accept him. If he succeeded, he would no longer just be one of them. He would be theirs. He exhaled slowly, feeling the fire in his veins, the lingering heat of every trial he had endured. Then, with steady resolve, he spoke. "Tell me where to find it." Morath lifted his head, his gaze distant. "The flame is buried deep within the hollow," he said, nodding toward the distant gorge where the land split open like a wound. "It burns in silence, waiting for the one who can carry its name." Aaron turned toward the hollow, his hands clenched, his body thrumming with determination. The dragons had given him a place in their world. Now, he would claim its fire as his own. Aaron stood at the edge of the hollow, the great rift in the mountain plunging into darkness below him. From its depths, the faint glow of the eternal flame pulsed like a heartbeat, distant but alive, waiting. The dragons had gathered along the ridge, their molten eyes watching in silence. None spoke. None needed to. This was his test alone. The wind howled through the gorge, thick with the scent of sulfur and burning stone. Aaron took a deep breath, feeling the heat press against his skin, feeling the fire inside him stir in response. He was not afraid. Not anymore. Vash stepped beside him, her crimson scales catching the light of the distant flame. "No dragon has touched the eternal flame and lived," she murmured, her voice unreadable. "It does not belong to us." Aaron turned his gaze toward her. "Then maybe it was never meant for dragons." Vash's golden eyes flickered. Then, with a slow nod, she spread her wings and lifted into the sky, joining the others. They would not interfere. They would only watch. Aaron stepped forward. The heat grew unbearable as he descended into the hollow, the air thick with shimmering waves of firelight. The stone beneath his feet cracked with each step, his boots leaving glowing imprints on the scorched ground. The deeper he went, the more the air itself seemed to shift, pressing against him as though testing his worth. Then he saw it. The eternal flame burned at the very heart of the hollow, a living inferno swirling in shades of gold and crimson, its shape ever-changing, alive in ways no ordinary fire could be. It did not consume the stone around it. It did not flicker or wane. It simply was. Aaron's breath caught. The flame whispered, not in words but in something older, something that reached into his very bones. He could feel it calling to him, waiting for him to take the final step. His pulse pounded as he reached out a hand. The fire moved. It surged toward him, wrapping around his fingers, curling along his arms, threading through his skin like veins of molten gold. He gasped, expecting pain, but there was none, only power. The fire knew him. It had been waiting, and in that moment Aaron understood. He had not come to claim the fire. The fire had been waiting to claim him. The hollow trembled as the eternal flame surged through him, its heat no longer a force of destruction but something more. A force of creation, of transformation. His body burned with its power, his vision filled with golden light. And then, as though the world itself had exhaled, the fire settled within him. Aaron opened his eyes. He was no longer just human, no longer just a survivor. He was flame-born. The mountain roared. The hollow trembled beneath Aaron's feet. The energy of the eternal flame surging outward like a tidal wave, spilling into the sky, announcing itself to the world. Above, the dragons stirred, their great wings unfurling as the light engulfed the peaks, painting the heavens in fire. Aaron stepped forward, his heart still hammering, the flame still alive beneath his skin. He had changed. He could feel it. The heat did not burn him. The fire did not consume him. It answered him. The moment he emerged from the hollow, the dragons bowed, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in recognition. Morath watched him carefully, his golden eyes unreadable. "The flame did not destroy you," he said at last. "It has chosen you." Aaron exhaled, his breath curling with embers. "I chose it too." A deep silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Morath lowered his great head, pressing his brow against the scorched earth. "Then you are no longer one of us." Aaron stiffened. Had he failed? Had the fire made him something else, something that no longer belonged? Morath's molten gaze lifted, burning with something deeper than fire. "You are above us." The other dragons followed, lowering their heads, their great bodies folding in deference. Even Vash, proud and unyielding, bowed her head. Aaron's breath hitched. They were not just accepting him. They were crowning him. The last human, once a sacrifice, once forsaken, had become the queen of dragons. Not because he had taken the fire, but because the fire had made him its king. The flames still coursed through Aaron's veins as he stood at the peak of the mountain, the dragons bowing before him, their massive forms silhouetted against the burning sky. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, heavier than the heat, heavier than the fear he had once carried. He was no longer a mere survivor. He was something more. The wind shifted, carrying embers through the air, and as Aaron turned, he caught sight of the distant horizon. The lands beyond the mountains, beyond the fire. The world that had abandoned him. The world that had fed him to the dragons as a sacrifice. And now, they would know what he had become. Morath raised his head, his golden eyes burning with something unreadable. "The eternal flame has chosen you," the great dragon said. "But flame is not just power, it is responsibility." Aaron swallowed, feeling the warmth still coiling beneath his skin, the fire responding to his very breath. "I didn't ask for this," he admitted, his voice quiet. Morath let out a deep, knowing rumble. "Neither did we, when the world turned against us. Fire is never given, it is earned." Aaron met his gaze. "Then tell me what comes next." Vash stepped forward, her crimson scales reflecting the molten glow beneath them. "The humans will come," she said, her voice edged with something sharp, something almost eager. "They always do. They will see the fire rise, and they will fear it." Aaron knew she was right. The moment the eternal flame had surged from the hollow, it had announced itself. The world below had seen the sky burn, had felt the tremors in the earth. And just as fire called to fire, fear called to war. "They will come to destroy me," Aaron murmured. "They will try," Morath corrected, "but you are not theirs to burn anymore." Aaron clenched his fists. He had been cast away, abandoned to the dragons as an offering, a thing meant to die. But the flames had reclaimed him. He was no longer theirs to sacrifice. He was theirs to fear. He turned to the assembled dragons, feeling their eyes upon him, waiting. "Then let them come," he said. "Let them see what they tried to destroy." And in answer, the dragons roared, their voices shaking the mountains, their fire lighting the night. The attack came faster than Aaron expected. The sky, once alive with the golden glow of the eternal flame, darkened with the arrival of warships, their metal hulls gleaming like dead stars. The humans had come, just as Vash had said they would. They had seen the fire rise, and in their fear, they had armed themselves with weapons meant to erase him. But Aaron was not alone. The dragons stirred at his side, their massive bodies coiling, their wings unfurling like banners of war. Their eyes burned with loyalty, not because they were bound by chains or commands, but because they had chosen him. Because he was not just one of them. He was their queen. The first blast tore through the sky, a beam of searing light meant to strike him down before he could move. Aaron raised his hand, and the fire responded. The air shattered, the blast consumed in an eruption of golden flame that curled and twisted around his fingers like a living thing. The humans had come expecting a boy. They had not prepared for a god of fire. With a single breath, Aaron unleashed the storm. The flame surged from his body, racing across the sky, igniting the very air itself. The dragons followed, their wings cutting through the clouds, their fire ripping through metal, their claws shredding steel. The sky became a battlefield of fury and flame, the warships struggling to maneuver, their weapons useless against a force that had lived long before they had learned to wield them. Aaron stood at the center of it all, his body thrumming with heat, his hands alive with power. The flames did not consume him. They worshipped him. The battle did not last long. The humans had come thinking they were the ones who held dominion over fire, that technology and metal could contain it. But fire does not bow, and neither did Aaron. As the last of the warships fled, their metal carcasses burning as they fell from the sky, silence settled over the battlefield. The world had changed in a single night. Aaron turned to his dragons, his people, and saw the reflection of his own fire in their eyes. He had been given to them as a sacrifice. Now, he was their sovereign. With a final breath, he looked upon the burning horizon where the remnants of the old world still lay, waiting. One day he would return, not as prey, not as a boy, but as the Queen of Dragons.